what I thought we might do tonight is look at some of the aspects of mapping and spatial data that have to do primarily with Sydney, but not exclusively. And rather than just show a lot of maps or go through some kind of chronological structure, what I thought would be better would be to share with you some of my experiences with dealing with this material, and also some of the techniques, some of the issues, some of the problems, I should say challenges, that arise when you deal with historical spatial data. The material I'm going to use tonight comes from a wide range of projects, and they've been supported over many years by lots and lots and lots of people, including, of course, New South Wales State Records, the State Library of New South Wales, and particularly also the archives of the City of Sydney and their absolutely spectacular Historical Atlas of Sydney, which is just brilliant and makes lots and lots and lots of historic maps of Sydney available. Archaeology has always had a clear understanding and placed great value on spatial data from its very origins, and that makes it quite unique in the humanities. So I thought I'd start, just to make that point, I thought I'd start with two sort of archaeological heroes of mine, and the first one is William Stukely, who mapped Avebury, the famous stone circle site, and published his findings in 1743. Now, Stukely was a very interesting man. He was one of the founders of the Society of Antiquaries. He was a friend of Isaac Newton and Edmund Halley. He was a member of the Royal Society. And he went through this exercise of mapping and interpreting this stone circle in the middle of the 18th century. All right, so he interpreted it as a Druid temple, and he gave Stonehenge an age of 460 BC. So his interpretation wasn't exactly right, but his observations were spectacular. And this is his published map, and you can see, just by comparing it with Google Earth, just how close it is and how accurate and how useful it was as a document. Another archaeological mapping hero of mine is Carl Weber, who worked at Herculaneum and Pompeii. He was, like many people who worked in Italy at that time, he was a mercenary, an engineer, a Swiss national, as it were, and he was seconded to the excavations run by Charles of Bourbon because the Royal Museum was being set up and lots of interesting things were coming out of the ground. So the effort was to find useful things. Now, Carl Weber got into a bit of trouble because he wasn't particularly interested in just finding things. He recorded, and you can see this is one of his original plans, where things were found. And he had a tendency to excavate whole buildings and whole rooms, not just dig tunnels to find interesting things. So he wasn't actually in a lot of favour. However, he did do a massive amount of work, and he was seconded and eventually ran the excavations which were funded by the Crown until Charles left to go and become King of Spain, which was a sort of better deal at the time. And when that happened, Weber put up a proposal to publish the excavation. And this is his draft proposal to the committee that ran the royal publication. The Crown had a monopoly on the publication and information about the excavations. And so he proposed that the material be plotted on a map, in this case it's 3D, a pictorial visualisation of this particular, what are they called? Villa. Yes. This particular villa, with all of the finds described and the rooms and spaces interpreted. Now, this was not received well. And after a couple of years, the committee came back to him with this response. The more natural method of publication, to avoid the confusion that would arise from Weber's method of mixing the paintings and the bronzes, marbles, medals, and inscriptions, such things distinguished by class and published in separate volumes is more successful in conforming to the pleasure and taste of erudite men. So his efforts failed at the first hurdle, and after 14 years of excavations, he died of lung disease, presumably from being down those tunnels for a lot of the time. But the idea was there, the idea that you interpret archaeological material in context, and you interpret whole buildings and whole assemblages, was there from the very beginning. The other thing I thought I'd like to do is share with you an experience I had a few years ago when I was attending a conference at the British Library. Part of the conference deal was that we were invited to go and visit one of the departments within the library. And I chose the mapping department. And at the reception on the first night of the conference, I found myself talking to Peter Barber, who's the curator of maps and topography at the British Library. And I said, "Oh, well, I'll be coming to see your department tomorrow." And he said, "Oh, what are you interested in? Because when people come, we like to get things out that they might like to see." And I said, "Well, I'm very interested in the historical mapping of Sydney." And he said, "Ah, I've got something you'll like." And so the following day, when we went for our visit, he pointed out that within the library, there is a separate library, which is this glass building, a completely separate building, which contains George III's original personal library, which is the initiating collection for the British Library. George III's son, the Prince Regent, wasn't much interested in books, so he decided he'd just donate his father's collection to the nation, and that's the origin of the British Library. So when the new building was built, they actually constructed this separate glass building within the main library building, and it's known as the King's Library. And we looked that morning at a volume from the King's Library. In fact, a somewhat obscure volume, King's Topographic Collection Supplements, volume 124. And what Peter explained to me was that he had been looking through the publication First Views of Australia, which was published in 1988 for the bicentenary by Tim McCormack and others. And as he looked through this handsome volume, he thought, I think I've seen one of those before. Now, included in that volume was two views of Sydney, one of Sydney and one of Parramatta, by Fernando Brambilla, who was an Italian artist who worked on the Spanish exploratory expedition which came to Sydney in 1793. And he recognised the drawing in the publication. They hadn't been published before. McCormack and his team had gone to Madrid, found the drawings, and published them for the first time. The expedition, when it got back to Spain, the political situation had changed, they weren't in favour, so there was no major publication of their findings, but all their material was archived and so on. So in the George III collection, there were two drawings, very similar, with nothing about them except, on the back in pencil, Brambilla fecit, Brambilla drew me. And sure enough, they were in fact matches for the two views which had come from the Naval Museum in Madrid. And this is the published version from the Naval Museum in Madrid, and it shows Sydney, first Government House, and so on, in 1793. What Peter Barber showed me was another version of the same view. And it's a perfect example of the use of topographic drawing as a source of information. If you think back to Stukely and to Weber, they both produced maps, but they produced them in a pictorial form. And until the middle of the 19th century, topographic drawing as a method of recording a landscape was seen as equivalent and interchangeable with mapping, until photography took over that role, essentially. So here we have a drawing, and these drawings were known to be lost. The expedition presented two drawings, or three drawings, I think, to Lieutenant Governor Gross. He included them in a dispatch. The dispatch went to London, and the dispatch still exists, but the drawings listed as accompanying it disappeared. And as Peter Barber explained, George III quite liked interesting drawings and maps and things. When the government had finished with the dispatches, they were always sent to the king to examine and read and whatever. And he had a habit of keeping things that he thought were nice. After all, it was his government. They were his dispatches. So he kept these two drawings. And after his death, without any information to accompany them, they were bound into the supplements, the 124th volume of the supplementary material, uncatalogued, which was dealt with after his death. And it was only that Peter Barber recognised the similarity between the two drawings that they actually came to light. So this is the drawing done in Sydney and presented to Lieutenant Governor Gross on site. Now, it's got some interesting differences from the Madrid version. First of all, there are two Indigenous people in the foreground. And secondly, there's this tree. Now, this is a big tree. It appears in lots and lots of drawings on the hill above the Lieutenant Governor's house. The Madrid version, which Brambilla did later, has two major differences. First of all, he took out the Indigenous people. They're a pictorial convention to show location and context. And he moved the tree to the right in order to get a better artistic effect. So the tree is used to frame the view. But that leaves us, or it leaves the artist, with a problem. What he did was put in some English settlers, some in uniform, in the foreground, so it makes it clear to his Spanish audience that this is the English colony. And in the gap caused by the tree, he added a building. Now, interestingly, from an artistic point of view, that's perfectly okay. From an archaeological point of view, this is a big, big problem. So that building clearly did not exist, and it never existed. But without the comparison of these two very detailed, very carefully drawn, different versions of the same reality, we wouldn't be able to know whether that building was real or not real. I might just say that Mary Casey has used the other drawing, the one of Parramatta, in her analysis of the landscape of Parramatta. And they also have a different, but somewhat more political difference, not so much in terms of topographic detail. Now, a lot of the significance of this comes in what's now sometimes referred to as the spatial turn in history. And it's the recognition of the use of this type of evidence in historical research and, dare I say, discourse. This is something that's always existed in archaeology. It's existed in archaeology from the very beginning, but it comes into historical writing in the mid-19th century when there's a departure from a look at individuals and biography and a focus on landscape and city and ultimately nation. So concepts of nationhood in the 19th century begin to be tied to specific spaces, and the spatial nature of historical investigation becomes obvious. So there's this ongoing and developing concern with the description of space and the experience of space and the management of space as a city, as a nation, as a household, whatever. And this is part of a broader cultural shift, and it's continuing. And now, of course, there are lots of tools that we can use to facilitate this, like Google Maps and Google Earth and so on. So the access we now have to spatial information is enormously enlarged, and it makes these kinds of inquiries a lot easier, but one has to be cautious. And a good place to start is a very important 1968 article by J.B. Hartley called Deconstructing the Map. And in it, he makes this polite observation that it's better for us to begin with the premise that cartography is seldom what the cartographers say it is. When I'm teaching about this material, I tend to use a more direct statement. I normally just say, all maps are lies. It's as simple as that. And it's true. So when you look at topographic information, whether it's in these pictorial forms or whether it's in the form of traditional maps, you have to examine and understand their meaning in the same way as you examine and search for meaning in any historical document. And of course, historical archaeology is constantly using all kinds of sources of information to understand the human past. So here's an example. It's a good place to start. Google images, all maps are lies. This is an image. It's reality. Well, no, it's not. And you can actually see that it's made up of a patchwork of separate images. If we look at the terrain version of Google, we get a different version of reality. This one shows with more clarity the street structure and places of interest and so on. Things are labelled. And then if we look at the road version, again, it's another lie, but it's a lie in the service of the purpose of the map, which is to make the important roads wider and to understand the street network and how to get around. So each one has its own purpose, and each one has a different set of criteria by which you would judge its validity. But in fact, they're all reductions of reality by scale. They're all very, very different versions and different representations of what we naively think of as reality. So let's have a look at what might happen, or what has happened, when this confronts historical inquiry. And I'd like to use this example. I have great fun talking about this with Grace Carstens, who's focused a lot of her research, obviously, on the rocks, and worked very closely with Kai Logan on the Cumberland Gloucester Street site excavations. And inside the rocks, she uses explicitly the air watercolours which were published in Mann's Present Picture of New South Wales. And this book was issued in London with these coloured views which could be tastefully framed and shown in your drawing room. They're based on a pair of air watercolours which were in the Dixon collection, and this is the one looking east across Sydney Cove from the rocks. There's a written commentary which goes with the plates, but if we look at the pair of plates engraved in London and the drawing done in Sydney by Eyre, it's easy to pick out prominent things like First Government House and the hospital at the rocks. And you can see the foreground classically framed in a sort of dark foreground pictorial technique, but otherwise they don't fit together. And the only way to make them fit together is actually to reduce the size of the air watercolour by about a third. Then they look very similar indeed, except we're left with this embarrassing right half of the London engraving. This, of course, is where Cumberland Gloucester Street site is. And so when Grace discusses it, she says, you can see the early houses, some of them being rebuilt and being made more substantial and so on. And these are the kinds of houses used by people like Armston and Crick. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a clue in the text, because the text, instead of identifying individual buildings, simply says the houses on the right, a spot called the Rocks, belong to different individuals, and some of them are very comfortable. If you look at first views in Australia from the bicentenary, the discussion of this engraving makes it quite clear that the buildings on the right of centre are simply invented by the engraver in London to make the two equally sized pictures for publication. Those houses do not exist, they have never existed, they are just made up. Now let's look at a couple of the maps from the same publication. This is James Meehan's map of Sydney from 1807, and we can see Fort Phillip represented there, irregularly begun but now rebuilding, and so it's shown as a complete redoubt. But if we look at lots and lots of later maps, we see that in fact it doesn't ever get completed. Similarly, there's some very odd things about the shoreline in this map. There are gaps in the shoreline, and that's a bit puzzling because the water could get in. And the answer is in a little note. Where breaks occur in the water frontage line, the original is torn. Aha! So if you look at the fine print, we're not dealing with James Meehan's plan of 1807, but we're dealing with a photolithographed version from the government printing office in the late 19th century. The original of this map has been lost. All we have is the lithographed later copy. So there are all kinds of issues then about how you interpret the later copy. The other map she uses to illustrate the change and development in the rocks is this map, which is a parish map of St Philip. It comes with enormous authority. It's signed by Thomas Mitchell and issued on the 27th of March 1834. But of course, this is a cadastral map. It's a map of land ownership. It doesn't show buildings. It doesn't show development in any way. It's not the kind of map that actually gives you a document which tells you about progress and change and development. So what we're looking at here is one of the problems that most people, and Grace of course is not alone in this, the problem of how we perceive maps. And Jeremy Black, in a book called Maps and Politics in 1997 said the ideology of modern cartography is that of accuracy, which is generally seen as an aspect of objectivity and impartial scientific realisation of reality. Most map users see cartography as a science, a skilled, unproblematic exercise in precision, made increasingly accurate by modern technological advances. But the issue is, what does the map actually represent? And every map is selective in what it says. Every map lies. The creator of the map makes choices about scale, projection, orientation, symbology, colour, title and caption, and any number of other things to give a particular message, not reality, but a particular message. And so this is how we have to interpret maps. And let's look at a couple of examples. This is a wonderfully accurate map of the City of Sydney in 1888 by the Surveyor General's Office. And if we take a close look at the area around Circular Quay, and we overlay that with the modern street grid in red, you can see that while elsewhere the streets match perfectly, here there's an offset of about 5 metres, a north-south offset for this block, both at Alfred Street and at Bridge Street. Now this is an error in the map. Whether it's an error in the survey or an error in the drawing up of the map, I don't know. But it is in fact a 5 metre displacement. Now that on a city scale map is not a big problem, but when you're planning an excavation, it can in fact be very significant indeed. So this is not street widening or a change of alignment. This is actually an error in what is otherwise a remarkably accurate map. Here's another example, this time a commercial map. William Baker's map of the City of Sydney from 1843. And if we look again at the Circular Quay end, what do we find? We find these large buildings. These buildings aren't an expression of reality. They come from this 1836 plan of proposed changes in street alignment and the new government house and Circular Quay. And you can see, if you look closely, exactly these buildings. So 7 years after this map, he has included these buildings in his map of the city as if they existed. Now this is a commercial map, so it has an agenda, presumably to promote his career, among other things. And the clue to understanding the real issue here is perhaps in the title. And if we look at the title, we can see the map is dedicated to the mayor and aldermen, councillors and citizens of Sydney. So this map is published the year that Sydney gets its first municipal government. And so this is a statement of progress and urban development. And so it shows Sydney in its best possible light. And it also shows William Baker, the land surveyor, in his best possible light too. Now, what I find really interesting is that if you look under the title, it says, this map of the City of Sydney is most respectfully dedicated by their obedient and humble servant, William Baker. Now, if you ask the historian to interpret those words, they would say, well, he's not actually a humble servant, it's simply a formula of words that's used in a conventional way, because it's appropriate. But the same is true, is often not true, of information in the map. The words can be understood as being not literal, but the map so often is being assumed to be literal. Now, one of the ways we can examine how the maps actually can be interpreted better is by using geographic information systems. So these are computer systems which allow us to take an image of the historic map and examine it in a way that just isn't possible in other circumstances. And this is an example of placing two historic maps of different ages, of different origins, on the modern map base using exactly the same points, so that any differences that show up are differences in the maps, not in the process of locating the map on its modern base. Once that's achieved, it's then possible to examine these historic maps in a way that just isn't possible before, and they can be interpreted and analysed in the way we look at any historical document. The intention of the creator, the audience, the likely bias that might arise, and the skill and accuracy, and in some cases with maps, the source information, all have to be considered in the way that we read any other historical document. And once it's possible to do that, one can look at these maps and examine them and interpret any differences in them. And the differences fall basically into two types. They are normally related to the physical state of the map. It can be damaged, torn, distorted in some way. Or there are errors in the depiction of buildings or works and so on. Now, for this you need historical information because, as we've seen, these maps can include buildings which never existed, streets which were never laid out, and all kinds of other things which don't actually exist. Once you have the ability to carefully analyse these maps, then you can undertake what's called retrogressive analysis, which is to go essentially backwards through time from the current map data, which has a pedigree, and look at how things were in the past. And retrogressive analysis was pioneered by Marc Bloch, the famous French medievalist, who realised that 17th and 18th century maps of the French countryside actually contained within them the medieval land system, which was itself never mapped. But the shadows of what was there could actually be detected in the later mapping system. So here's the main roads of Sydney for 2010, and by a simple process of subtraction, we can arrive almost precisely at Lachlan Macquarie's 1821 list of public roads that he's responsible for creating. That works for some things but not for others. So the parishes that we're all very familiar with, which were promulgated by Mitchell in 1835 and have been used as the basis for land description ever since. Before that, however, there were the land districts, and they were fluid and they changed over time, and they were never mapped in great detail, but it's possible to do that in a digital form using descriptions and so on. So that's going backwards through time. Now, this presents some challenges, and so this is one of the things I referred to earlier. What techniques do you use to achieve something like this? Many of you will be familiar with the detail series, the maps of Sydney and its inner suburbs from the 1880s and onwards by the Surveyor General's Department at a scale of about 1 to 500. So very accurate, showing every building, every fence, every toilet, and so on. Now, these are all gridded from the point of the grid origin, which is Trig Station E, and Trig Station E is the pinnacle of the time ball on the observatory. So all of those maps are gridded in a very interesting 6-chain grid from that point. We can establish that point, and then we can establish the 6-chain grid as it exists in the modern landscape, and then geo-register the points marked on the map to the points marked in the digital geographic information system. And we can then extend that grid across the whole of inner Sydney, and then using that grid place precisely all of those map sheets. There are about 700, and there are several editions of some sheets. So we can actually reconstruct with great precision the location of every building on those map sheets. We can try and do the same thing at Parramatta on the same grid. It doesn't work because the surveyed difference between Sydney and Parramatta from the 19th century is incorrect by about 97 metres. But nevertheless, once you define that error, you can do the same thing, the corrected grid for Parramatta, and then all those 1 to 480 scale map sheets showing every building and every fence line and every street in Parramatta with enormous accuracy. But not with perfect accuracy. These are historical documents and they have flaws and they contain errors. There are a couple of sheets where the grid lines weren't put in, which is a bit embarrassing, but there you go. However, when you go through a process like this in a digital environment, it's possible to measure the error and capture it and use it for further reference. So each of these map sheets was geo-referenced, and then the error, the discrepancy between the scale shown on the map and the scale created by the referencing process is recorded, and it's shown here by colour. So blue means very accurate, and the more yellow, orange and red is the less accurate. But we're talking here about a matter of half a metre or so. But nevertheless, it's important to know the likely error within the environment that you're working. There's another issue which comes up a lot with historical data, and that's non-spatial mapped data. And this is an example I was involved with a little while ago. Bungarraby, spectacular Francis Greenway house in Western Sydney, which was demolished in the 1970s by OTC because, well, it was old, wasn't it? And it sat on this ridge overlooking a creek which curved around it, beautifully sited with this wonderful two-storey circular turret in the corner. Now, one of the surviving documents that related to it was this survey, this surveyor's notebook page from Edward Knapp, done in 1832 when the property was being sold. And it gives the dimensions and somehow the location of the formal garden. God and Mackay Logan were doing a work on the property and they said to me, can you interpret this? No one's been able to work out where the garden is and we would like to know where the garden is. So this notebook page shows the house with its circular turret and it shows the garden, which is a formal laid out garden and orchard, and it shows a feature down here which becomes obvious later on is actually a pond bisected by a causeway. Now the data here is really very simple. The bearings are given from the house to the corners of the garden. The dimensions of the garden and the orientation of the sides of the garden are also given. And you can use that to reconstruct and find the location of the garden on the landscape. So here's the site in a 1951 aerial photograph. If we add the modern topography, you can see the ridge on which the house stands and the creek line curving around defining that ridge. If we sight out from the house along those bearings, we get those two lines. Then if we find the place where the bearings and distances fit, we find the sides of the garden. And then we can look in detail at the more recent aerial imagery, and sure enough, in the right light, you can actually see the rectangular pathways and garden beds of the garden there in 2010. And then you can see the suburban development in progress in 2011 and then last year. So if we'd been able to interpret the location of the garden earlier, we may well have been able to make a case for saving it. All of the earlier work on the site suggested the garden was right next to the house, on the same ridge, and the distances weren't understood. The distances, of course, are in chains. And, of course, the garden wasn't on the same ridge as the house. It's a very large garden, and so it's sited on the slope across the adjacent valley. So you can see the garden from the house and the house from the garden. But that relationship, of course, is now lost. So once we have this kind of data, what do we do with it? There are a number of things we can do, but one of the most obvious ones is to take the data contained in these historic documents, once we're satisfied we understand how to use them, and do other things with them. And here's an example, again, one which you're probably all familiar, H. Percy Dove's Fire Insurance Plans of Sydney. This is the 1880 edition. There's an 1889 edition as well. This is from the City Council archives. There is a key map, which is extremely useful, and each opening page in the volume gives 1, 2, 3, 4, or sometimes more blocks of the city. And we're going to look at this particular block, which is bounded by George and Pitt Streets, with Liverpool Street and Goulburn Street to the north and the south. Now, with a GIS, or in this case even Google Earth, it's possible to take the image from the book of plans and place it in its correct location on the modern cityscape. It's then possible to trace the outlines of the buildings shown in the Dove map, and also, in this case, trace the colour coding. Red is brick or stone, in other words, fireproof. Blue is metal, and yellow is wood. So the material affects the insurance premium, which is what these maps are actually about. The functions of all the commercial buildings are also recorded because that relates again to the premium and also the fire risk. So if you're next to a blacksmith, then your premium is going to be higher. The thing I like most about this particular map is that it also has clear evidence of the 19th century sense of humour, because up here on the corner of George Street and Swan Street, which no longer exists, we have the Honest Lawyer Hotel. Now, because the data also includes the number of stories, it's very easy to generate a simple 3D model of our block, and if we wish to, we can then compare it with what's on the block now. And you can see the George Street frontage, the building's poking out. That's not an error. George Street has been widened and straightened at that point. Another thing that's possible is to derive data not just from one set of maps, from a number of maps. And this is some work that I've done with a number of students and interns over many years. And this is a digital record of the changes in the shoreline of Sydney Harbour from invasion to the present, using a very wide variety of maps, but all consistently, or at least very judiciously, geo-registered. So now we're looking at mapping not just of the past, but mapping through time and documenting the European impact on the Parramatta River estuary. And another thing we can do is to take existing data and make it spatial once we have an understanding of the historical space. And this is another document that many of you will be familiar with. This is the assessment books from Sydney City Council. They contain the address, the person rated, the owner, the type of building, the material, the roofing material, and the value. And they're available through time for a number of years. And they have recently been digitised by the spectacular team of volunteers at City Archives. And that makes it possible to take that information and plot it on a map. And we're looking at the 1860s data here. And at a very simple question, the patterns become blurred if you look at the whole city, so I just chose a little subset here. So here we have buildings by use in the rocks. So we have red is commercial, purple is residential, commercial blend, and blue is residential. And you can see the concentration of commercial and mixed buildings along George Street, but otherwise there's a clear blend of the building function types throughout the rocks area. Then we can look at themes, maritime related enterprises or people, residents, and non-maritime. And once again, not clustered around the shoreline, but all through the rocks. There are businesses and residents who give their occupation as something to do with shipping or maritime enterprises. And then the other classic question which always arises with the rocks, the concept of the rocks as a slum, as a place where poor people live. And so we can map the occupation class of the residents at the rocks and look at the mix. And interestingly enough, the majority are obviously skilled or professional. There is not a large proportion of semi-skilled or unskilled workers living in the rocks in 1864. And here, to make that pattern even clearer, you can see if we compare just professional with unskilled in the rocks from the assessment books, there are very many more professional grade residents than there are unskilled workers. And then I set myself a little challenge to demonstrate that some data is entirely spatial. And that is Sydney in the middle of the 19th century, there's a pub on every corner. And the answer is no, there isn't a pub. There's a pub on every corner and every pub is on a corner. Now it isn't entirely true. But I suspect if we look at this pattern developing through the 19th century, it will actually become more and more. There's a pub on every corner. So you can see that there are lots of corners without pubs. Most pubs are on corners, and it's rare to have two pubs on adjacent corners at this stage, but that does happen, I think, more later on. Now, the other data from the assessment books could be analysed in a database or a spreadsheet. It's just quantitative information. But here, this is an entirely spatial question. You can't ask or answer this question without a map. So what this process does is take either existing spatial data from historical periods or non-spatial data which has some kind of spatial signature and put them together so that we can investigate the past more fully, which is what archaeology always wants to do. And to finish with an example, the 1879 International Exhibition with the enormous Garden Palace building, the largest building in Sydney at the time by a long way. This is one of the exhibition site maps identifying all the buildings. that were part of the exhibition in the Botanical Gardens and the domain, and it's been geo-registered, so it's been precisely located. If we look at that closely and make it transparent, we can see where the Garden Palace sat in what is now the Botanical Gardens, and how there are some relationships between the site of that building and the current layout of that area of the gardens, but not many. But we can do something else as well, and that is look at that building and the other buildings in a broader context, which again is what archaeology is so often about. Context, context, context. So the geo-registered map can be looked at in a three-dimensional view, and then the buildings with a little bit of historical research on their vertical dimensions can be reconstructed, and then it's possible to compare those buildings, especially the Garden Palace, with the modern streetscape of Sydney in 3 dimensions. The Garden Palace is 4 times the volume of the Queen Victoria building. It's absolutely enormous. And until modern skyscrapers were built in Sydney in the 1960s, it was far and away the largest building Sydney had ever seen. So there you are, the past in context. Thank you. It was made of brick and wood. It had brick foundations, and but most of the superstructure was made of wood. It was built very quickly, and that's why it burnt down so spectacularly. Yeah.
Brambilla was a spy.
Oh, I think his boss was a spy. I mean, all the expeditions, all of these exploratory expeditions had an agenda, and they reported formally or informally on the condition of the settlements they visited in terms of their viability and their military status and so on. And everyone involved knew that, but they were always very polite about it. Bougainville's account of Sydney, which has been published in full, the formal report has been published for a long time, but only a few years ago his actual text, his original narrative was published, and that had all kinds of commentaries about the various aspects of Sydney. Again though, being a historical document written by him, didn't talk about the affair he had with a woman while he was visiting Sydney, and why the expedition stayed much longer than they were supposed to in Sydney. However, but one of the interesting things about the Spanish expedition of 1793 was when they arrived, they had an Irish sailor. So they sent the Irish sailor ashore, of course he could speak English, to greet the Lieutenant Governor and announce their arrival and suggest that as a mark of respect they could exchange a salute of guns, as you sort of normally do. Lieutenant Governor Gross had to reply that he wasn't confident about the condition of the guns in the settlement. It was probably not a good idea to try and fire them, which is about as much military information as you really need.
You quoted from one of Jeremy Black's books. As a specialist, do you regard that book as pretty good?
Oh yes.
Because he's very versatile and quite prolific.
Yeah.
Mostly probably military history.
And there's another book of his on historical atlases, which is also very interesting.
Mapping books are pretty good.
Yeah, and he discusses the fact that when you map historical phenomena, you can map ancient biblical topics and ancient empires, but once you get into the Middle Ages, everything falls apart. And so basically, no one tries that until you get into the 19th century, where you have nation states which can be defined by a border. The problem with the Middle Ages is that you have shifting loyalties and feudal responsibilities, so that nationality isn't defined, and your status is defined by which feudal lord you're responsible to. So feudal states, which don't really exist, tend to be a patchwork, and so trying to map medieval Germany is just impossible. So in the 19th century they just didn't do it. It wasn't worth it.
The Holy Roman Empire.
Oh yes, but it changed. People changed allegiances within the Holy Roman Empire, from year to year, depending on disputes and family alliances and so on. So it really is very, very difficult. It's a very interesting insight into the fact that there are some things that are almost impossible to map, especially on paper. Nowadays, of course, we can do it digitally. We can animate through time. It makes a big difference.
I noticed you had a map. It may have been Mitchell's of Bathurst.
I don't think it was Mitchell's. It might have been. It might have been. Yeah, yeah. That's from a project I did with Ian Jack on the Macquarie towns.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You wrote the book. But there's obviously at the moment, because of 2015 with Macquarie, we've been involved with the surveyors to try and refix where the flags start.
All right. It's not too difficult, I don't think.
Oh, that's good.
Yes. Yes. I can certainly give you
Your techniques.
Yes, certainly give you a very
circle right on it.
a very close approximation because it appears on all the maps well into the
But the current terrain,
1830s.
because of flooding and things like that, it looks as though it could be in the river or something.
This is a possibility. One of the issues with this process of georegistration, taking a historic map or a historic set of data and putting it in the right location, things like riverbanks and road alignments and things like that, very dodgy. Even the most meticulous surveyor is not going to survey a coastline in great detail or a stream bed in enormous detail. They will do some points on it, but then they'll sketch in the rest. However, if it's a property boundary, money is involved. And so money is spent on property boundary surveying. So it's possible to take, with the digital cadastral database of New South Wales, it's possible to take 200 years of professional surveying effort and use that as the basis for locations. So, for example, when I'm looking at locations for historic maps, I tend, and I teach my students and interns, you don't use the street frontage. You use minor streets or laneways, you know, in the centre of the block, or easy to recognise property boundaries well away from the street frontage, because streets get widened and properties get amalgamated and so on. But you can actually, you often find the points of correspondence well away from the city. Or in the case of the 1880s detail series, the whole set is gridded. So once you've re-established the grid, all the locations are then very easy.
We did have line surveys done on the survey general.
Yeah, well that's exactly right.
Towns and you have buildings, and at least then you can rejig the colour.
Exactly, yeah. And those are all now digital, so you can actually, and that's how I did those maps for Macquarie towns.
How you could overlay. Thank you.
Doesn't Susan Sontag say that photography lies also, not just maps?
Oh, absolutely.
So
But perhaps less so.
So is your message to be as suspicious as possible and do lots and lots of corroboration?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, all historic documents,
Lie.
yes, yes, exactly, yeah.
Well, you wouldn't use it to issue a title properly.
No.
So your initial undergraduate degree was in archaeology, and you branched out into sort of what you might loosely call geology.
Well,
Geography.
no, because it's, this is archaeology. I do this in Angkor, in Korea, in Chile, and in Greece,
I just think most people,
and in Central Australia.
I
Yes.
think most people who, back when I was younger anyway, the people who did archaeology were those who weren't much good at science. That was my impression anyway.
Well, we like to think that archaeology has moved on a little.
It's a science, isn't it?